Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole starts with a seemingly superfluous side character, oh that was a lot of alliteration, and eventually gets us to 19th century British Parliament and the downside of immortality.
It's Big Ben, kids, Parliament!
But we have to get there. We gotta follow the rabbit hole all the way down and get to it. But before we do that, I want to let you know about this booklet I made for Chanukah, Shivim Panim LeDreidel. It has a bunch of cool insights on dreidel in it, as well as variations on the dreidel game, and also some riddles.
They call it a doodle. Woohoo! Look at him go!
You can download that on creativejudaism.com, and I'll put a link in the description. Okay, good. Now that that's over with, we can jump into the rabbit hole. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Vayeshev, is mostly about the story of Yosef, or Joseph. We hear about his dreams and how his brothers got jealous of him and plotted to kill him, and Reuven and Yehuda both played a role in negotiating them out of it and saving his life, and eventually they decide to sell him into slavery, and then Chumash cuts away to the story of Yehuda. I was gonna say that this is the only time Chumash cuts away from the action and goes to a different story, but I mentioned it to my wife, and she pointed out that there are other times. One example that she thought of was the story of Lot, where we cut away from Avram and Sarah and what's going on with them, and go over to the story of Sodom and its destruction. So this isn't the only time Chumash does this, but it doesn't happen often. So before the Torah continues and tells us the rest of what happens with Yosef, it cuts away to Yehuda and tells us about his life, how he moved away from his brothers and his father, and he started his own family somewhere else. This is what it says in the Parsha. Vayehi ba'es hahi vayeded Yehuda me'es echav vayet ad ish adullamite u'shmoi Hiram. And it was at that time that Yehuda descended from his brothers. He turned away from them until he came to an adullamite man whose name was Hiram. Okay, so already it's a little bit weird because it could have just told us that he went to Adullam instead of giving us a human being as a landmark. Why does Chumash tell us that he went until he got to this Adullamite man named Hiram? And then also, why does it tell us his name, Hiram? Who is this guy? Why is he important? And he actually shows up 2 more times. He is mentioned 3 times in total in this week's Parsha, and then never again anywhere else. And in all of the times that he is mentioned, it's never very consequential. The second time he's mentioned is after Yehuda's wife passes away, and it says that Yehuda was seeking consolation and went off with his friend Hiram. And the third time he's mentioned, I'll get to a little bit later. But suffice it to say, it's weird that he's mentioned at all. In fact, as far as I can tell, there is no mention anywhere else in all of Chumash of a friend. The word Re'ehu, his friend, is used in other places in Chumash, but never to refer to an actual person. It's used a bunch of times to mean fellow, like don't do this to someone else, or something like that. And it's used at least once, I think multiple times, to refer to pairs of objects, like some buckle in the Mishkan or something. This buckle and its counterpart, its friend, Re'ehu. I don't remember the exact case, but it was something like that. But it's never used for a person, so Hiram is the only friend that we find out about in Chumash.
Friends.
We know Avram Avinu, Abraham, had a loyal servant named Eliezer, but he was never called his buddy. But Hiram, Yehuda's buddy, we find out about, and he's mentioned 3 times. So I thought that that would be a good place to start. Who is this guy? Why is he mentioned? What else can we find out about him? You in? Good. Let's jump down that rabbit hole. We'll start with Rashi, who gives us a pretty dry explanation of who this Hiram is. Rashi says that Yehuda made a business partnership with Hiram. Mizrahi fleshes that out a little bit and lets us know that Rashi's answering a question. He says that Rashi tells us this is a business partnership because otherwise, what's the reason for Yehuda leaving his brothers and going to this guy? So according to that, the whole reason why Yehuda left his brothers and his family was to go pursue his business with his business partner. But Radak explains it completely differently. He says that Yehuda was just pitching his tent and letting his cattle graze in various different places until he got to this guy. And when he got to this guy, Hiram the Adullamite, they became friends. So we got Rashi's version that Yehuda left his family and went with the specific goal of pursuing business, and Hiram was his business partner. And then we got Radak saying, no, Yehuda was just kind of aimless, and then he just met this random guy and they became friends. Okay, so after I found a couple of different interpretations of who Hiram was and why he was important to Yehuda, that's when I started expanding my search radius a little bit. And I started doing some digging, and I searched for the word adullamite. And what I found is that it actually has a definition in the English dictionary. And apparently it means a small group of people that break off from some larger political or intellectual group. So I did some more digging, and I found that the origin of the term used in this way comes from an event that happened in 1860s British Parliament.
Big Ben.
Parliament.
Apparently there was a group of liberal MPs that were a little bit less liberal than the other liberal MPs. And other liberal MPs were trying to introduce voting reform to allow more people the right to vote, and the less liberal MPs didn't want more people to have the right to vote. And one of their opponents called them adulamites. Now, this is not a reference to Hiram the Adullamite. This is a reference to a story that happens later on in Nach, in the book of Shmuel, in the time of David HaMelech, King David, before he became king. When David was running from Shaul, at one point he hides in a cave in Adullam, and it's there that he gathers all of his family and all of his supporters. So this British Parliament guy was making fun of the less liberal guys, saying, you're a bunch of ineffective people hiding in a cave. Which is strange to me that he would use this reference, because in that story, David is the good guy, and eventually he wins. So it's a weird reference to use. One more slightly interesting thing to note would be that when these liberals were fighting the other liberals, they ended up siding with the conservatives, who at that time were led by Benjamin Disraeli, who, even though he didn't identify religiously as Jewish, was born Jewish. So several thousand years after Hiram the Adullamite was the friend of Yehuda, we have some British Adulamites who are also the friends of a Jew. But that's kind of a stretch, and really this whole British Adullamite thing is connected with the story of David HaMelech and not with the story of Yehuda. But I did find one source from the Bnei Yissaschar that connects this cave that David HaMelech hid in Adullam to the story of Yehuda and his friend Hiram the Adullamite. He asks the same question that we asked that sent us down this whole rabbit hole, which is, why is this guy mentioned? And his answer is that all of the Shvatim, the 12 sons of Yaakov, had Ruach HaKodesh, a divine vision to be able to hear and feel and see things that might not otherwise be perceptible to other people. And he says after he was kind of fired by his brothers, because he had this leadership position with his brothers, remember he told his brothers, don't kill him, just sell him. And some commentaries say that after this whole story, the brothers came to Yehuda and said, hey, if you would have told us to give him back, we would have. So it's your fault that this whole thing happened. And then they fired him from his leadership position.
Flintstone, you're fired!
But whatever the case, he was one of the older brothers, he had some sort of authority, and then he left them. So according to the Bnei Yissaschar, after he was demoted and lost his leadership position with his family, he saw with Ruach HaKodesh that Adullam was a place where the rulership of his descendants would begin to grow. Because Adullam was where the cave was, where David HaMelech, who was descended from Yehuda, hid, and that's where he gathered all of his supporters and all of his family. So from one perspective, that's where his kingship kind of began. So according to this, the reason why Hiram the Adullamite is mentioned is because it lets us in on Yehuda's motivation, that he was drawn to this place because somehow it represented the rebirth of his leadership. And it's worth noting that this is where Yehuda began his family. But the details of how that family formed and his daughter-in-law Tamar, we'll get into that later on. Okay, so at this point in my research, while I was searching for the name Hiram, another name kept on popping up. Hiram with a mem at the end, and that's a different guy. Hiram was the king of Tsur, who lived at the time of David HaMelech, King David, and also Shlomo HaMelech, his son, King Solomon. And this king, Hiram, was known to be a friend of David and Shlomo. And he donated wood to the building of the Beis HaMikdash, the temple. But like I said, that's a totally different guy, who lived about 600 years after the time of Yehuda and Yosef and all of those guys. So the first few times that name popped up, I ignored it. But eventually I started paying attention to it, and what I found was a midrash that says that they actually were the same guy. The midrash says, Hiram hu Hiram. Hiram was Hiram, and that's why he was so nice to David and Shlomo, because they were descendants of Yehuda. And since Hiram was Yehuda's buddy, he continued to love Yehuda's descendants. But like any good midrash, there's two opinions, and the other opinion says, no, Hiram was a different guy. And then the Midrash tells us that according to the first opinion, Hiram lived for 1,200 years, and according to the second opinion that it wasn't the same guy, he only lived for 500 years. Okay, so there's a few things to unpack here. According to Eitz Yosef, which is a commentary on Midrash, this Midrash isn't just telling us that this guy lived for such a long time, it's telling us why he lived for such a long time. And it's because he was such a good friend to Yehuda and to Yehuda's descendants. And so as a reward for that, he lived this extraordinarily long life. But this commentary goes on and tells us that even according to the second opinion, that Hiram isn't Hiram, even according to that opinion, Hiram is actually Hiram's descendant. And that's why he was so nice to David and to Shlomo. Because Hiram, who was Yehuda's buddy, taught his family and all of his descendants to love the family of Yehuda. Okay, so according to this commentary, either way, Hiram is still connected to Hiram, which is good, because there's a lot of interesting stuff about him, and now we get to keep on going down the Hiram rabbit hole. And the first interesting thing is that if you noticed in the Midrash that the first opinion said that Hira is Hiram and he lived 1,200 years. The second opinion said he's not the same guy and only lived for 500 years. Well, if he's not the same guy, then why did he live for 500 years? What's going on? But even according to the first opinion that it was the same guy, it says he lived for 1,200 years, which is too many years. According to Chabad.org, the whole Yosef story happened in the Hebrew year 2216, and David HaMelech, King David, became king in the Hebrew year 2884. Now, according to the robot that I asked to do the calculations in between takes, that's only about 600 and something years. So even if you pad it before and after, you still don't get to 1,200. So the reason for the extra years, according to both opinions, is not because of things that happened earlier, but because of things that happened hundreds of years later. In the book of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, there's a story about the king of Tsur, who became very arrogant and started to proclaim himself as a deity. And Hashem sends the Navi Yechezkel, Ezekiel the prophet, to go relay a message to this king to tell him how bad he is. Now in Yechezkel it never names the king, it doesn't give him a name at all. But all over Gemara, the Talmud, and in Midrash, for example this Gemara in Chulin, it does identify this king of Tsur as Hiram. So if we hop on back over to the timeline, we see David HaMelech became king in 2884. And Yechezkel was doing his prophet thing in 3332. I didn't ask the robot for this calculation, but it looks like that's about 500 years later. Which gives us the 500 years of that second opinion in Midrash, and also if you pad it on the sides, gives us the 1,200 years of that first opinion. So if we put this all together, Hira, who was Yehuda's friend, lived another 600 and something years, and continued to be a friend to Yehuda's family, and helped out David HaMelech and Shlomo in building the Beis HaMikdash, and then as a reward for being such a good friend, continued to live another several hundred years, until eventually, I guess, the immortality got to him, and he thought he was a god.
You've had 3 flu shots! That's for the daycare center!
I'll be a living God!
Okay, so this is fun. Let's keep on going with Hiram. A little later on in that story in Yechezkel, it says this: Be'eden gan elikim hayisa. You have been in Eden, the garden of God. So Hashem tells Hiram, you've been in Gan Eden, the garden of Eden. So that's weird. Was Hiram in Gan Eden?
Of course, Doctor. The Garden of Eden was just outside Moscow.
According to any of the math that we did, he wasn't that old. Rashi throws a little cold water on the situation and says it's just talking about how lavish of a lifestyle Hiram led. But, according to Midrash, he still wasn't in Gan Eden, but somehow it's even cooler than if he was in Gan Eden. The Midrash tells us about a disagreement between Rabbi Chama bar Chanina and Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina is arguing that death was not originally part of human existence. He says the original plan was that Adam Harishon, Adam the first man, was never supposed to die. And then he uses that verse from Yechezkel to explain why Hashem decided to create death. It says in the verse, you were in Gan Eden. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina says, of course he wasn't in Gan Eden, so then why did Hashem say this? He's telling him, I was thinking about you in Gan Eden. I was thinking about what you would become, how you would live for such a long time, and eventually think you were a god, and so Hashem created human mortality. So like I said, Hiram wasn't in Gan Eden, but somehow Midrash made that cool by giving us the reason for death. The Midrash continues with Rabbi Yonasan's counter-argument. Rabbi Yonasan says, according to your logic, Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, that death was created because some people are bad, and if they live too long, they'll eventually do bad things. So he asks the question, then why didn't Hashem just make it so that bad people would die? Why make it that everybody dies? And the answer the Midrash gives is that if only bad people died, then bad people would do good things, so that they wouldn't die. And you'd end up with a world full of bad people doing good things for the wrong reason. I saw a commentary that explained that the reason why this would be a bad thing if everybody was doing good things for the wrong reason is because it would eliminate free choice. If you know that doing bad things makes you die, you can't do anything bad. The way I understood it, and I didn't see any commentaries saying this, but this is what makes sense to me, is that being good isn't supposed to have such a clear incentive. People should be good because it's good. And if being good was a way to escape death, it would just devalue the concept of goodness. Either way, we get a lot of fascinating philosophical information from the Midrash, all because Hiram was never actually in Gan Eden, but Hashem thought about him in Gan Eden. But there's another source that says that Hiram actually was in Gan Eden, but not at the times of adullamation. In Derech Eretz Zutta, which is one of the minor tractates of the Talmud, a tractate of the Talmud that isn't based on a tractate of Mishnah, it gives us a list of 9 people who it says entered Gan Eden alive. They never died, they just went straight to Gan Eden alive. It's a fascinating list, and probably each one of those could be a rabbit hole in and of itself, but I'm not going to go into it here. One of them you may recognize is Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet. And you know he's still around because he came to your Seder last year and drank your wine. But another one of the people on that list is Hiram, our Hiram, the guy who lived for bazillion years and eventually thought he was God. And then it ends the list by saying that according to some opinions, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was also one of these people that went to Gan Eden, which would change the list from 9 people to 10 people. But what's important to our investigation is that it says that Hiram went to Gan Eden alive, which is weird. So what's the deal? I thought that whole story in Yechezkel was about how he was a bad guy for thinking he was God and he was going to get punished. And now we find out that he was rewarded with never dying and just went straight to Gan Eden alive? To make matters more confusing, there's a midrash in Yalkut Shimoni that explains exactly how he died. I'm not going to put the quote on screen because it's actually pretty gruesome, but it's in the source sheet if you want to look at it. What it says there is that Nebuchadnezzar, who is a different emperor, tortured Hiram and Hiram's mother, and he eventually died a horrible death. So before we continue with the obvious question that we were leading into, I'm going to point out something else interesting, which is that according to this midrash in Yalkut Shimoni, Hiram's mother was still around. So either she lived even longer than Hiram did, or this midrash and this Gemara aren't compatible. But that's always the boring answer, and I definitely don't want to do that with our bigger question, which is, what happened to Hiram? Was he punished for proclaiming himself a god by dying a horrible, torturous death? Or was he for some reason rewarded for it by going straight to Gan Eden alive? But we may be able to answer all of this according to another midrash somewhere else in Yalkut Shimoni. It gives pretty much the same list of 9 people who went to Gan Eden. It's in a slightly different order, but it's the same people, and Hiram is on it. But the end is slightly different. Instead of just saying, according to some opinions, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also was among these people, it says something different. It says, according to some opinions, Hiram was removed from Gan Eden, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi took his place.
He is from this day forward banished.
Now, we could start speculating about a timeline, but fortunately, there's a source that lays it all out for us. I actually didn't find this source myself, and I think it's worth pointing out because this whole rabbit hole is about friendship, that this source came from a new friend.
Thanks to you, we learned the best way to make new friends is to just be yourself.
Somebody who watched the rabbit hole and started sending me interesting things that I had missed. And I mentioned to him that I was looking into Hira and Hiram, and he did some digging of his own and found an answer to this question from Eliyahu HaKohen of Izmir. He puts all these sources together and lays it out like this. He says that Hiram was rewarded with not dying and just going straight to Gan Eden because of all of his kindness to David HaMelech and to Shlomo, because he donated wood to the Beis HaMikdash. But while he was there, he started getting full of himself, and that's why he got kicked out. And it was after that that he started thinking of himself as a god. And then that's when he was punished, and he died a horrible, torturous death. So I'm glad we got it all sorted out, but I'm also kind of bummed out about the possibility that Yehuda's buddy Hira could have eventually gone really bad and died a terrible death. So I'm rooting for the second opinion in that first midrash that we looked at. At any rate, that's the bottom of the Hiram portion of the rabbit hole. But there's still a couple more fascinating things about Hira. If you remember at the beginning I said that Hira is mentioned 3 times in Chumash.
1, 2, 3.
But we only talked about 2 of them. The 3rd time he's mentioned requires a little bit of background. So Yehuda left his brothers and his father, and he started his own family. And he had 3 sons, and the oldest son married a woman named Tamar, but he was a bad guy, and he died, and they didn't have any children. Now there's a concept in Jewish law called yibum, which is that if a man dies without having any children, then if his widow wants to, she can marry his next of kin, and the first child that they have together will be considered as continuing the lineage of the original husband. So Tamar did want to do this, and she married Yehuda's second son, Einan, who was also a bad guy and purposely made sure that they didn't have any children, and then he died. So now Yehuda's 3rd son is in line, but Yehuda holds him back. He's worried that his 3rd son will die, which wouldn't have happened because the first 2 died because of bad decisions that they made. So Yehuda was in the wrong, and he held back his 3rd son. And Tamar was left in the lurch. She couldn't remarry anybody else, and she couldn't continue the lineage of her first husband, which is what she wanted to do. After Yehuda's wife passes away, Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute, and Yehuda doesn't recognize her, and they're intimate. And he doesn't have any cash on him, or sheep for that matter, and so he leaves his coat and his signet ring as collateral. A signet ring in ancient times is basically basically your signature. So it's very valuable and very identifiable. And I assume the coat was pretty nice, like cashmere or something. Actually, I have no idea what cashmere is, but I think it's fancy. Anyways, Yehuda goes back home and he sends a goat for payment to pay this woman, but she's nowhere to be found. In the meantime, Tamar's pregnant, and people start talking and saying, hey Yehuda, your daughter-in-law, who's not supposed to marry anybody else, is pregnant. Wonder how that happened. And they're saying terrible things about her, and her life is actually on the line, because she's accused of being an adulteress. So she sends a message to Yehuda. She sends his ring and his coat and says, whoever these belong to, that's the father of the child. And Yehuda realizes what happened, and he realizes that she was right, and he clears everything up. And a few months later, Tamar has 2 twins, one of which is named Peretz, from whom David HaMelech, King David, is descended. So the outcome of this whole strange story is the entire Davidic dynasty, including, eventually, Mashiach. Okay, so where does Hiram come in? Well, when Yehuda sent this goat as payment, he sent it with Hiram. Here's a painting by Rembrandt of Yehuda giving the goat to Hiram, but I don't know why Hiram is a kid there. That's weird. There's no evidence in Chumash to support that, and I assume that they were of roughly the same age. Anyways, at this point in the story, Yaakov still didn't know that this was his daughter-in-law, and that everything was actually kosher. He thought that in his moment of sadness, looking for comfort, he had done something wrong, and something potentially embarrassing. And who's the guy he confides in about this potentially embarrassing thing and asks for help? Hiram. So from the very beginning of this rabbit hole, what I was hoping to find was something about Yehuda and Hiram's friendship. And at the beginning of my search, I did find one thing in English on some website that mentioned that there are commentaries that talk about how wonderful their friendship is. But I couldn't find any commentaries like that. I searched and searched and searched, and eventually I found one source from the Vorki Rebbe. He says that the whole reason why Chumash tells us about Hiram is to show us what a true friendship is.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
And he says that even though Yehuda confided in him the darkest secrets of his heart, Hiram still loved him. And he points out something else, that Hiram wasn't just a regular guy. He was an important guy himself. There are other commentaries that say this in different ways, and it definitely, according to the Midrash, that he eventually was the king of Tsur, that would make sense. Whatever the case is, it's not like Yehuda asked somebody who had nothing to lose. He didn't ask Hiram because Hiram was a guy who frequented places like this, and will send him. He told Hiram because they loved each other, and he knew he could trust him. And then Hiram did it. He took that goat, and he was looking around for this woman, and he was asking all around about something that was potentially very awkward and very embarrassing. But he did it because he loved Yehuda. And the Vorki Rebbe adds, where can you find such a dear friend that you can even tell about the bad things you've done? So my wish to all of you watching this is that each and every one of you should be fortunate enough to find a friend like Hiram, somebody who you can confide in about the things you've done wrong, but you know they'll still love you. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you find any interesting information that I didn't find, or if you have any questions that send me down another path, please put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you find a signet ring down here, I don't know whose that is. You can keep it. It's not mine.